So that is this reverb bass stab that I'll be showing you how to make in this tutorial video. You can kind of classify this as a lead sound as well. In this case, I'm using it more like a bass would be used in tracks. That's why I decided to call it a bass. But it's also kind of a lead because we also do have this additional bass. But because of the way I'm using it, it's more of kind of a bass stab. So this will be a pretty fun patch. We'll be using the Tal LX plugin again to create a nice vintage sounding synthesizer patch that's nice and phasey. And then from there, we'll be adding in this really large reverb and heavily compressing everything to get that really interesting reverb swell sound that you're hearing on that bass. So let's go ahead and open up the plugin. And the default patch just sounds like this. Nothing too crazy, but we can make some adjustments. Let's turn off the saw waveform and just make a really full sounding square wave bass. So we'll turn on this other square wave and bring down the volume of the sub oscillator down to about 8 or so. And if you're curious about the values, you can see them on the screen right here. So that sounds like this. So we're getting a pretty nice and rich tone. Let's make a few different adjustments to the pulse width. So change this over to the LFO mode. So the LFO is triggering the square wave to give it some nice movement. Let's go ahead and take this pulse width all the way up to 100%. So that's an amount of 10. That sounds like this. So it gives you that really awesome phasing tone that you hear on a lot of square wave basses. And then from there, let's also go over to the LFO. Just bump that just up a little bit, maybe to about 1.4. And this will give us just a little bit of pitch modulation on our oscillators, which will further that kind of detuned analog sound that we're going for. So this low frequency oscillator is triggering the pulse width. So it's shifting that as we hold the notes on our keyboard. And it's also adjusting the pitch of both of those oscillators. Let's make some adjustments to that LFO. Change it over to the key sync mode. So that way every time I press a key on my keyboard, it's always starting off at the same position. And then what I want to do is go over to the rate control and drop that down to just under 2. We'll do about 2.30. And that's going to give us a bit slower of a modulation. And then the other thing that I want to do is take the delay time and put that at about 0.25. This will slightly delay the start of this LFO. The initial attack transient of the sound doesn't have any of the modulation on it, but then that modulation kind of fades in, which will make it feel a little bit more punchy. Now let's go over to the filter and start to give our sound some movement. So drop that down rather substantially, maybe about 2.7 or so. So 2.78 will work great. Then we can keep the resonance where it's at. So far it doesn't sound like much, it just sounds like this. So that's where the filter will close once it completes its modulation that we'll create here in a moment. Now let's get that filter to start moving. We'll take the envelope control and boost that up to about 6.26. Then we want to go ahead and swap this over to the envelope mode. So that way the ADSR controls the movement of our filter and also the volume of our oscillators as well. If you change it over to the gate mode, it'll only be applied to our filter. So because we have this kind of interesting bass whomping sound that we're going for, we want to make sure that that is applied to both volume and the filter. So the first parameter will be the attack. Let's go ahead and push that up. So we'll do 4.65. So it kind of swoops inwards. So the sound kind of moves in. And then we could turn down the decay, probably pretty long though, just so it kind of slowly decays out. We'll put that at about 7.76. Drop that sustain down so the volume that it gets to once it finishes its decay is quite a bit lower. We'll do about 2.70. Go ahead and just kind of adjust that until you get to just about 2.70. Let's also have some release. So once we take our hand off the keyboard, then that sound kind of takes a little bit to die out. So it feels a bit more like an ambient swell. And we can turn that up to about 4.46. So this sound almost emulates a brass stab or something like that, and provides this kind of interesting ambient swell element for the track. Now let's go over to the chorus mode and turn on type 1. And we're going to get this nice analog sounding chorus, which is where all the cool character of our bass line is going to come from. And then from there, we can add in a few different effects. We'll start off with some built-in effects from Ableton. So we'll use the saturator. Now we're going to add just a bit of crunch to this because it's kind of this nice distorted bass line that's sitting on top of everything. So we'll do a drive amount of 7, and that's going to sound like this. So we're getting a rather substantial volume boost of quite a few decibels, but we also get a nice crunch on the top end. This just helps the sound feel even more filled out, which is what we want for this ambient swell element. Now let's add in some equalization. We'll jump over to our plugins, use the Pro Q2. You could use any parametric EQ, I just like this one. So we'll go ahead, have that at 128, because that's where kind of these bassy frequencies are sitting. And then those will be taken care of by this sort of rolling bass line that we created in the previous video. So we don't need those frequencies for this sound. We'll change this to 24, so it's a bit steeper of a cutoff curve. So all the stuff we're cutting out sounds like this. So it's all this really low subby stuff. But we don't want to cut out too much of these low mids, because this is more of a top layer for a bass line. We don't want to cut out all these nice full bassy frequencies. And depending on what you're going for with your track, you could always adjust this accordingly if you need either more bass let back in or more bass cut out. It just depends on what you need for your track. And then let's bring out some of the crunch of this sound, so that way it cuts through our mix and we can kind of hear the interesting texture that's on top of everything. So we'll go ahead and go to 3,500. That'll be our frequency value. And we're going to have that be 2 decibels, so it's a pretty subtle change, it's not too much. And then a reasonably wide Q. And the frequencies sound like this. So this is just adding a bit of presence to the bass, and that'll help it cut through all these different elements. And then let's move on to the main character of our bass, which is going to be this reverb. And you could use any long reverb here. You could use a built-in one inside of Ableton. You could use a Valhalla plugin. There's quite a few different options here. Just want to make sure that it has the ability to make a long reverb that's going to be over 4 seconds. So let's first change this over, make it a bit more bright, maybe about 70%. And that way, just so that reverb isn't too dark, because if it's too dark sounding, you won't be able to really hear it clearly in the mix. So that's why I've went ahead and increased the brightness. If there's an EQ control on your reverb, you could always use that to do the same thing. We'll change that over to the chorus mode. That way it's nice and phasey. And then we'll go over to the space and change this all the way over to just over 4 seconds. And it sounds like this. So it's a really, really big reverb. Let's go over to our dry wet. Put that at about maybe 37 or 38. Actually, probably bump that up to about 40. Now let's also cut out the sub bass, just so we don't have any weird phasing issues. And then on its own, that reverb isn't super loud in the sound. It's not totally washing out everything. So the loudest thing that we can hear is the bass stab at the beginning, then the reverb's happening afterwards. But what we want for this sound is a very huge sounding reverb that's being sidechained underneath the rest of the track. So we're going to compress this rather heavily, which on its own is going to sound a little strange, but in context of everything, it's going to sound really awesome. We'll go and use the glue compressor again, one of my favorite Ableton devices. And we'll go ahead and change the attack up to 10, so that way the bass kind of punches through on the initial attack transient. We'll leave the release where it's at, so that way everything takes a little bit of time to jump back up on volume, just so it has a nice compression on it. Leave the ratio at 4:1. And then we'll take that threshold down to negative 32.7. So this is really going to squash our sound quite a bit. You can see we're getting quite an intense compression here. It's about 15 decibels or so of compression, which on its own does not sound that great. But once we turn up that makeup gain to about 15, we can make up for that volume change. Actually, probably put that about 14.3 or so. And now that reverb is super loud sounding. And once that's sidechained underneath the main track, it's going to sound really cool and it's going to fill up all that empty space. So if you don't want that really intense reverb effect, you could always bypass this compressor and bypass the reverb to get a more classic synthwave type bass. But if you want something a bit more ambient and a bit more kind of in the dark synthwave category, you can enable these two effects devices to create this really interesting ambient element. And then let's also add in a utility plugin. This will be used to create the sidechaining. So I'll just create that new automation, and I'll just copy this on over. And it's the same sidechain automation from before in the previous video. These are all 16th notes, has a fade in, so they're real short fades. And then at the very end here, whenever we have this kind of drum fill that drops in for the rest of the track, I have everything dropping out in volume, so that way the fill kind of punches through, and it kind of gives a nice shuffle to everything. That's purely an optional step depending on what sound you're going for. And then we can go ahead and listen to what our finalized bass sounds like. We'll adjust that volume just so it matches. And the final bass sounds like this. So we'll take a look at those notes. Basically, it's the same pattern being repeated each of these different sections, with the exception of this part where I have the volume cutting out. So that's why I removed this kind of main note here. That just depends on compositionally what you're doing. Here I have this nice drum fill that I wanted to punch through. That's why I did it that way. But taking a look at this note pattern, it's very, very simple. And it's got kind of this interesting accent going on here. So the way that this works is just playing the D note, which if you remember is the root note of the entire track. So this main rolling bass line is also playing that D note as well. And it plays that for most of this section so that we get that nice reverb sound. We can hear the filter kind of closing as everything's being reverbed out. And we get this nice pumping sidechain effect for the whole track. Then I'm adding a bit of tension to the very last part of this by going up to this F note. Which is leading the listener back down to this D note. The other thing that I'm doing here that's also worth noting is I have this lower D note playing at the bass. You can kind of hear it's that accent that's happening lower down. This is giving the track an interesting shuffled feel, and just helps make this part feel a little bit more interesting. Because it's pretty simple on its own, that just adds a touch of variation that keeps it feeling fresh for the listener. Looking at these other parts, I have the same thing, except I've got it layered with this upper D note. So it starts off over here, then goes down this lower D note. Which just kind of switches things up just a little bit and adds a bit of variation, and it creates a more interesting pattern for the listener. That way things don't get too static and too boring. So I recommend trying little melodic variations like this inside of your patterns because it'll add just a little bit of flavor. So that is all for this dark reverb stab. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial video, and I'll see you in the other videos inside of the course.